Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Sharon Faison, librarian and co-chair of CPL's African American Heritage Committee. On behalf of everyone at the Chicago Public Library, welcome. This event is part of the 2021 One Book, One Chicago season, exploring the theme, Neighborhoods, Our City's Bedrock, and the book, Bedrock Faith by Eric Charles May. Please visit onebookonechicago.org for other upcoming programs, reading recommendations, on-demand video content, and more coming to now through the end of the year. This program in One Book, One Chicago is generously funded by donations to the Chicago Public Library Foundation. Visit cplfoundation.org for information on how you can get involved with their work. This event is co-sponsored by CPL's African American Heritage Committee, and we thank them for their support. Today, we explore when House ruled Chicago. During the time period of this year's One Book, One Chicago title, Bedrock Faith, we can imagine what the characters were listening to, dancing to, and experiencing. We also think about the importance of house music in Chicago's history and how the genre helped build and strengthen the community. Here to talk about it, we are so pleased to welcome Marcus Chapman, screenwriter, music historian, author, radio personality, and TV One's Unsung contributor. Marcus Chapman discusses how a movement of music, radio, parties, fashion, and cassette tapes defined the city in the 1980s and early 90s. Please join me in welcoming Marcus Chapman and One Book Chicago's coordinator, Jennifer Lysak.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And thanks, Marcus, for being here. We're so happy to host you.
Hey, thanks for having me.
This is going to be great. We're so start by telling us a brief history of house music in Chicago.
Brief, huh?
I know that could go for hours, right?
Right, yeah. Okay, well, the interesting thing about house is that if you talk to, let's say, 5 different people and ask them what house was or where it came from, even if all 5 were from Chicago, you might get 5 different answers, because a lot of it was based on what part of the city people grew up in, you know, what radio stations did they listen to, what parties they attended, and their age. There's certain things that are not really up for debate so much. So house music came from the disco era. Apparently there's a guy named Robert Williams here in Chicago. He's from New York, started a club. He wanted DJ Larry Levan to come to Chicago and DJ the club, but Larry Levan was working on getting the Paradise Garage going in New York. So he recommended his friend, Frankie Knuckles. So Frankie came to Chicago, 1977, DJ'd at the club in the disco era. And then, you know, one of the big things that people talk about in a whole lot of different documentaries is the whole disco demolition night. There's a rock DJ in Chicago, Steve Dow, who was working for the rock radio station. He had actually lost his job because he was on a different rock station, and they switched to a disco format. So he's ticked off. So he organizes this disco demolition where people can bring records for 99 cents to get into the White Sox game. They're gonna blow these records up. So they blow up all the records in the middle of the field. People go wild. They start tearing up. The White Sox had to forfeit the second game. And so in a lot of documentaries, people point to that as sort of the turning point of disco no longer being major. So it's sort of in the ashes, so to speak, of disco emerges house. And the term itself came from the club that Frankie was playing at. It was actually called COD, but a lot of times people don't follow the actual title or names. Just like songs. There are songs that have certain titles and nobody's ever called the song by its title. They just go by whatever the hook is. So people just called it The Warehouse. And so describing the kind of music that was being played, it got shortened from warehouse music to house music. And it was basically a combination of the disco from the 70s, some regular R&B dance music from the 70s and early 80s, and eventually tracks that DJs started making themselves.
That's great. So you talked a little bit about disco. What else sort of influenced the early sound of house music?
Well, disco would be the main thing, but like I said, it was also just regular dance-oriented R&B music. You know, you had funk and you had disco. Funk was a little more raw. You didn't have a lot of funk as a part of house music until a little bit later, but it was mostly, you know, like Philly international stuff. A lot of the stuff that was done in Philadelphia in the 70s was the foundation for house. So say like, for example, there's a rhythm section. There's a rhythm section of Earl Young on drums, Ronnie Baker on bass, and Norman Harris on guitar. They were involved in just about everything that came out of Philadelphia in the 70s, mostly Philly international stuff at first, but then they branched off, started their own production company, and they started producing a lot of other artists, Lolita Holloway, Eddie Kendricks, First Choice. I mean, some everybody, you know, so that was kind of the foundation of house. And initially, when people got into house, in terms of what we now know as deep house, that's what it was. Initially, it was the club scene. You know, you had Frankie Knuckles, you had Ron Hardy, who was like his main rival. They were like Frankie Knuckles was sort of like Earth, Wind and Fire. Ron Hardy was sort of like Parliament Funkadelic. You know, they were the two biggest DJs, you know, and they're the ones who are the most celebrated. But you also had a whole lot of other DJs who were involved in making these parties go. We had the chosen few DJs. You had cats like Wayne Williams and Alan King and Tony Hatchett and Jesse Saunders. These guys, they're what I call first generation house. What's intriguing is that while they were a part of that movement and creating all of that, the rest of Chicago slowly starts to learn what's going on in these clubs. And the biggest thing that happened to spread it was radio jumped on these mixes that they were doing. And mixing itself was a big deal too, because typically people just played songs from beginning to end. But most of us had never heard of this mixing where they would, you know, they didn't necessarily play the whole song. They may play from the middle to close to the end and bring in something else on beat. And the first time a lot of us heard that was through radio, through WBMX.
Thinking back to, this is an era before, you know, internet, social media, how people sort of discover music now, right? Radio was kind of the main way.
Yeah, it was the way. You know, you had the people going to the clubs who made that house scene, went out and danced, but radio exposed it to everybody else. And so now, one thing I found out over the years in talking to different people is, even though BMX was the first station most of us heard playing this music, a lot of people say WKKC 89.3 was a college station, Kennedy King, that they were actually the first ones to have a mix show, and that BMX copied their format. And because BMX was the bigger professional station, they got the credit and they did most of the exposing to music. So that's a little tidbit that people have kind of found out later. But BMX had the Hot Mix 5. They were the biggest thing. No, they started in 1981 with that show. I got introduced to them in the summer of '83. I was like 10 years old. I had 3 cousins who were a little bit older than me. They were like 2-3 years older. And they were always the ones who exposed me to whatever was hit, whatever was happening. So summer '83, they exposed me just to what we call the mixes. And in those mixes, you heard a lot of music that it's like, what is this stuff? It sounded great, but you didn't know who the artists were, first of all. A lot of it came from foreign countries. A lot of it was Italian. Some of it wasn't even spoken in English, you know, but the music was great. The singing sounded good. I mean, you could move to it. It was fun. And a lot of times we would just make up titles to the song because we didn't know what they were saying, you know. But later on, people started to describe that as Italo disco, you know, from Italy, even though some of them were from other countries as well. That's mainly what you heard on BMX in those mixes. It was Saturday Night Live, Ain't No Jive, Chicago Dance Party. You heard that the Italo disco, and then they would also play, depending on the DJ, they would play like popular, just regular dance songs that were out. You might hear Madonna Get Into the Groove or Holiday. You might hear Michael Jackson, Billie Jean, or Rick James, Cold Blooded. A lot of that stuff was added into those mixes in 83 and 84. But where it started to change was Farley, because you had Ralphie Rockin' and Rollin' Rosario. Later he changed his name to the Raz, but it was Rockin' and Rollin' Rosario. You had Mickey Mixon Oliver, Scott Smokin' Sills, Kenny Jam and Jason, and Farley Funkin' Keith. Before he became Farley Jackmaster Funk, he was Farley Funkin' Keith. So Farley was the first one to kind of start going away from that type of sound and into the real house sound, where you heard the Philly International type of stuff, or just the regular underground disco. People like Ron Hardy and Andre Hatchett and all of these folks were playing. He was the guy on the radio that most of us found out that real house music from. I remember one of my cousins sitting me down in August of 1984 and saying, "This is house music." So it was like and it was totally different from what we heard before. A good example, it was a lady named Lolita Holloway. She was a singer from Chicago. She was hot in the disco era. She had, underground. And so she had a song called Love Sensation that originally came out in 1980, and they did a new version of it, or a new mix of it around 83 or so. So that was played in the mix. And then she had a song called Crash Goes Love. Crash Goes Love incorporated the 80s technology, the drum machines and all of this. But when he sat me down to talk about house music, he played a song, it was Farley mixing, and it was a song called Hit and Run. Hit and Run sounded nothing like Crash Goes Love. I could tell it was the same person, it was the same voice, but it was the musicianship sounded more soulful. The whole feel of it was more soulful, and it was realistic instruments. Matter of fact, check this out. This is the album that Hit and Run is on by Lolita Holloway. You had First Choice. They were probably the most prominent group in terms of what people heard house music. They had songs like Let No Man Put Us Under. So First Choice, they're the group that had a lot of records that got played in house music as well. So this album here is from 1977. It has Dr. Love and it has Let No Man Put Us Under, which is probably, if there was one song that really kind of defines house music overall, I would say it's Let No Man Put Us Under. A lot of DJs did edits of it. Ron Hardy had 2 different edits of it that, people still play to this day. And most people know it as It's Not Over. A lot of the bits and pieces of the ad-libs that the lead singer, Rochelle Fleming, Rochelle did a lot of ad-libs in the song, All Shucks, Honey, Let Me Tell You Something. And people have chopped that up and made other records. So those types of songs define house music. And it was very different from the Italo disco, the foreign stuff that we heard. And pretty soon, most of those records kind of got pushed to the side and didn't get played anymore after about 84 going into 85. Even though now people say that it's house music, at that time, I never heard anybody say that music was house. But history kind of ends up changing a little bit as time goes on.
So we have little Marcus. He's listening to the radio. He's hearing this music. He's got his big cousins who are, the cool older cousins who are sitting him down, telling him what to do. Now let's talk about you getting a little bit older. How do you find out about that stuff? How did the flyers, the posters, the cassette tapes play the role that it did in spreading the music around from the clubs to the younger people who maybe weren't old enough to go to the clubs just yet?
Right. Well, you still had radio was still the biggest thing. Okay. So because I can't not just say this. So you had WBMX and then you had WGCI. They were the 2 big stations. But the stations that really had the most influence on us, that led us into everything else, were on the opposite end of the dial. And they were mainly college stations. So to WKKC earlier, they had a big program called Friday Night Audio. And so they had their mix show. You had Hugo Hot Mixin' Hutchinson, Brian Furious Frazier, Lloyd Devastating Jackmaster. They all had these cool nicknames. And whereas when you listen to BMX and GCI, those mixes sounded like they were made for people who were a little older than us. Whereas the KKC mixes sounded like they were made specifically for younger people. They would have all these crazy sound effects they would add into the mixes, and they came off as being really fun. Now, what was interesting though, WKKC was 89.3. You're on the South Side, you heard that. And they went off the air at midnight on Fridays at that time in the 80s. So there was one night I'm at my cousin's house. We listened to KKC. They've gone off. We just up talking. And all of a sudden we started to hear some more music. I'm like, wait. So we adjusting the antennas. And it's like, okay, KKC's back. And we noticed, like, well, wait a minute. It's not WKKC. And it turned out it was another station called WNUR, which was affiliated with Northwestern University in Evanston. Now, if you were on the South Side, you couldn't hear them because you heard WKKC. But like I said, they went off. And then we got exposed to WNUR. NUR was even better than KKC. Their mixes were deeper. They played more the club type of house that you would hear. That we didn't know that that's what it was, but we could tell that it was like on a different level than what we had been used to hearing. So WNUR, you had these cats, T. Chablis and Sweet MD. I remember they were their names. And they were the first guys I ever heard on the radio who sounded like they were really trying to get the girls. Because one guy, he would go, T. Chablis. And it's Sweet MD. That just sounded like a name to get girls, you know. But what was cool about them, they did their own mixes, but they also invited other DJs around the city to submit mixes. And one of the DJs that they got on there was Ferris Thomas. Now, I heard Ferris at a party in February 1985. Okay, it was the first real party I ever went to. So I was at my cousin's house. So we found out there was a high school girl who was having a party at her house. It was a Saturday night. And my aunt said that we could go to the party, but we had to be back by midnight. Now, keep in mind, I'm in like 7th grade. My cousin's a freshman in high school, you know, and they know these upperclassmen who, you know, they're used to the house scene. They're like totally into it. So we end up all walking to the party. It was on 88th and Oglesby, and we go into this basement, and I'll never forget, before we got there, we found out the party cost $2. Imagine that, $2 party, right? So one of the upperclassmen, his girlfriend was there. He didn't have the money. So he found out I had $5. So he made a deal with me. He said, if you give me $2, let me borrow $2 to get into this party. My girlfriend will give you a kiss. It's like, you know, keep in mind, I'm like, you know, 11, 12 years old. So this high school girl, you know, gives me, you know, a kiss. I mean, she might as well have been a grown woman as far as I was concerned. So I got the kiss. We got to the party. We get to the door, and the girl at the door collecting the money, she's like, how old are you? I said, 13. I handed her the money real fast. Went in the party. And when we got in there, it was really dark. Ferris was like at the back of the room, and there were like maybe 7 or 8 guys just around watching him mix. And I kind of figured they were, you know, other DJs or guys trying to DJ, and everybody's like looking at the records to see what he's playing and all of that. And at that time, a lot of the records that were being played in house that people like Farley and Frankie Knuckles had, there were like bootleg versions of those records that were more accessible to younger DJs. So I'll give you an example. So there was one of the more popular house cuts was called My First Mistake by the Shy Lights. They were, you know, a big group in the early 70s, known more so for ballads. Have You Seen Her, Old Girl? So this is the original Shy Lights with My First Mistake on it, all right? But there was a bootleg label called Lost Records, okay? And what they would do is they would make 12-inch singles. And so this is the bootleg version of My First Mistake. Now, a lot of times DJs, they would put markings all on it so that nobody could see it, and they would just have one part so they would remember what it was. So this is a different Lost Records here. It's a totally different song that was popular, TSOB, and you can see the label, but they didn't even have any information. So that shows you how bootleg it is. You don't know who wrote the song, how long the song is. You don't know any of that. But these type of records were very important in spreading house because it gave access for other DJs. Another one was Ram's Horn records. This is not actually bootlegs. These are actually, Ram's Horn was a reissue label. They actually had the rights to reissue other records, mostly that were on Soul Soul. So say like, this is a Soul Soul Orchestra record right here, the Soul Soul label and all of that. And Ram's Horn put out a lot of, and if you look at the back, so if you look at the back, see all of this wording, those are the titles of records that they had on Ram's Horn. And there was a record store that was really big in the history of house music called Imports, etc. Okay. So in early 85, like right around the time when we went to that party, I think it may have been the next weekend or 2 weeks later, my cousins and I went to Imports to buy a house. Okay. We were going to buy these house records. And it was really strange because the first time I went to a record store was in like 1977. And it was so colorful. It had all these album covers, posters, and all of this stuff. But when we went to Imports, it was nothing. It was like almost every record looked like this. It was like, what in the world is this? You know. And then what's funny is on the back it says, "Are you missing one of these Ram's Horn 12?" It was like, am I missing one? Yeah, I'm like missing all of them. You know. And they were kind of expensive. They were like $7, $8. You know, for just to get 2 songs. So we each ended up getting like 1 record a piece, but we all kind of determined after that, for us at least, house was a genre to record on tape for mixes and not worry so much about trying to get the records because there was no way we were going to get all this stuff. You know?
So how about the flyers and the posters and how that kind of spread throughout the community and the artwork and that as a method of marketing that people used earlier on?
Yeah. So what happened, you had the tapes, you had the flyers and the posters. Okay. So like I said, we would tape stuff off the radio. So for example, this is a tape of Farley on WBMX in 1985. A friend of mine had, in the winter of 91 going into 92, his cousin had a whole shoebox full of mixes. Say like it might have been 30 tapes, and I dubbed like 29 of them. So this was one, because I don't have any of my original tapes from the mid 80s, but I got a lot of it from that shoebox. So this is a Farley mix from BMX. This is a tape from WKKC from 89. So these tapes are really how we, you know, got access to the music. And the thing that happened at that time in the 80s was the double cassette tape deck came out. So before, you had to have one radio and another radio, you put them together and play the whole thing and, you know, make a copy. With the double cassette tape deck, you didn't have to do that. You put 2 tapes in, boom, record, and we would make copies of the tapes and spread them. So while we were doing that, we would come across, a lot of times you might be out riding with your parents and you would see these posters that would advertise the parties. And it might say, I remember one big poster said, the power plants Frankie Knuckles and the music box Ron Hardy meet at Sawyer's or Sours. Here different pronoun. We called it Sawyer's, but it may have been called Sours. So you would see a poster like that, and that would let you know that this big party was happening. My cousin actually got one, because we would always try to get the posters off they would tie them up to the street poles, like for the street, and we would try to get them and have them hanging up. And so my cousin got one. There was one, Steve Silk Hurley was one of the hot DJs at that time as well. And there was one poster I'll never forget. It was designed like a wanted poster. Normally they just had words, but there was a wanted poster that somebody drew, and it said Steve Hurley, alias Silk, and it had his sister name on it. He had a sister who DJ, alias Sis, that wanted for playing house music. And it was like, whoa, this is a cool poster, you know? And so you had the posters, which were harder to get, but the flyers were a lot easier to get. And matter of fact, at the time, we didn't even call them flyers. We called them pluggers, okay? And a lot of times what they would do is they would take the title of a popular house song and they would use that as like the theme of the party to attract attention. So like when we went to that party in February '85, the hottest record out was I Can't Turn Around by Isaac Hayes. That was like the big house cut. And so you might see a flyer that says I Can't Turn Around, and that would immediately let you know that this was a house party, and they would have where it was, they would have the DJs. And so, matter of fact, this is gonna be able to see, but I took a picture when I went away to college in 1990, because I used to collect all of these flyers, and I put a bunch of them on a bulletin board. So this section right here was all house music flyers. I know it's a little bit more difficult to see because it's hard to see even if you're looking at the picture, but all of these different things were flyers for various parties. Now you see right here, this little part says AK nightclub and that Hardy. So those were bits and pieces of posters where I cut the DJ's name out and put them on there. So those flyers, people would hand them out, say like at the train station on 95th Street, where all the buses come in, you would have somebody out there handing out flyers. And if they gave one to you, it felt good because that meant they thought you were house. So it was real cool to get the flyers, and that helped spread the word, not just about the parties, but about house music in general, because if you didn't know what it was, you were intrigued. And another thing they would do, they would have the names of a lot of the high schools on the flyers to attract the kids from the schools, because it's really crazy to think about this all these years later. But a lot of the house music scene was based around high school kids. You know, a lot of the schools would have their own parties. They would hire the different DJs. They may hire Ferris to come in and DJ their party, or Andre Hatchett or Farley. And the biggest school that did that was Mendel. It's a school that closed down. I believe they closed in '88, and they ended up merging with they were all boys school, and it was an all girls school called Unity, and there was another co-ed school. They merged to create a school called St. Martin de Porres. But when it was Mendel, the Mendel parties were the biggest thing for high school kids to go to. Unfortunately, I was not in high school yet. I had the chance to go to one Mendel party in 8th grade. My mother vetoed that idea. See, my aunt let me go to the house party. She was fine. I was with my cousin, but my mom like, nah, your time will come. So I never made it to Mendel, unfortunately. But it was all the rage. And there were kids younger than me who went sometimes, you know. But Mendel was a big school. And that's why when I talk about the first generation house guys, they were out doing their thing, and then you had the other DJs emerge. But it started to trickle down to the younger people because of the radio exposure. Because kids always want to emulate whatever is hit. So house was the thing in the mid 80s, 84, 85, 86. I mean, that's house really did rule Chicago. And that was all part of the whole thing, along with fashion and everything else.
Well, I was just about to ask about that when you started talking about, you know, kids emulating what the cool things are, as, you know, what were people wearing while they were clubbing at this time?
Yeah, well, even if they weren't clubbing, it wasn't just the club people, because we weren't old enough to go to the clubs, but some of us emulated the fashions of the people who were a little older than us. So in the 80s, in particular, you had certain designers that were popular. And a lot of these designers have been gone for years, like over 30 years, but anybody who was around remembers. You had Union Bay, you had Genera, you had Willie Ware, a guy named Willie Smith. He specialized in blazers. I remember I had a black blazer with white pinstripes on it, you know? And so that was one. Certain designs were known for particular items. So say like Giorgio Armani had these tank tops, and they had GA on the front. And so it was like almost like some kind of bird design on them or something. And so a lot of guys wore the GA tank tops. You had Gucci. They were, you know, Gucci's been around for years, but at that time, the main thing they made that house people like was the Gucci belt. They had these interlocking G's, and you had the Gucci belt below that. For the girls, a lot of times they wanted the Gucci purse. Okay. Then you also had another designer called Coach. Coach was like leather. They made purses for girls. They made belts, and what they would do, they had like a little thing of leather attached to a little chain, and it would hang down so people would know you had the Coach belt, or if the girls had the Coach purse. You had Louis Vuitton. They started to come along and had portfolios. Some kids had, there was a designer called Eddie Bauer. I don't even think they did clothes at the time, but a lot of people had Eddie Bauer book bags or portfolios that they would carry, you know, smaller amounts of books or notebooks in. All of that stuff was going on. But the biggest designers were Guess and Jabot. So Guess was really hot, like 84, 85, and they specialized in jeans, but they were like stonewashed jeans, like gray and black, and you know, they had this cool, and a lot of times they would have leather on there. So you would have, I remember I got my first pair of Guess jeans. You know, I had some black ones, I had the stonewashed grays, and it was like, oh man, and they were one of the few designers that had two logos. So they had like a rectangular logo that said Guess, and it had like some stitching or something. And then they had like a triangle with a question mark, and it said Guess above it in red, and the question mark would be red. So when you saw those logos and those designs, you knew that person was house. And probably the biggest status symbol at the time was a Guess jacket. So it would be a combination of the jeans, the denim, and leather. So you might see somebody with a gray Guess jacket with beige leather patches on it or something. Like I remember my cousin had one. There's a girl I remember seeing on the 95th Street bus, 95th East. She was a pretty girl. She had on a blue Guess jacket with brown leather on it. And I remember seeing her, this was like 86. I remember seeing her on the bus. I ran into her at a party like 20 years later. And I said, you know what, I remember you had your Guess jacket with the blue and the brown. I know a Guess jacket 2 Christmases in a row. I didn't get that, but I did have a Guess shirt, I had a Gucci belt, and the most popular designer of them all ended up being, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but it's how we always pronounce it, Maureen Francois Jabot. Okay. Jabot ended up ironically becoming big around the country toward the end of the 90s for jeans. But in the mid 80s, I remember seeing jeans, but they were really known for slacks. And what they did, they had the baggiest slacks, these big giant slacks. And that was considered the housest thing you could have. Okay. So I remember I had like my cousin got some from one of the upperclassmen we went to the party with. He gave them to him. It was like, you know, hey, you cool. Yeah. And my cousin was like, wow, you know, I got some, you know, so then when my cousin didn't want them, I got them from him for $20. You know, he charged me for them. But so they were these really big baggy pants, and at the ankles you could like button it, because you never wanted the ankle part, the bottom of your pants, to be wide. That was like a 70s thing. So if you did that in the 80s, people would clown you. Okay, so the ankles had to be small, but the pants were baggy. And I was a really skinny kid at that time, so you probably could have fit 2 of me inside these jabots. Okay, but check this out. So like I said, they became better known for jeans later on, and I wore jabot jeans for years. But I found a pair that kind of looked more similar to the slacks from the 80s. I found these a few years ago when I was in Dallas. So these are jeans, but they designed sort of like the slacks. So they're like really big and baggy. And you can see they would always have their tag here in the front, the Jabot tag. And then on the back, they would have this on there as well sometime on the belt. And they would have a tag. And matter of fact, just about all these designers, they had tags. You know how you had tags for your clothes? So what I would do, I would keep the tag and put it up on my wall. So like the same picture that I showed you with these flyers, at the very top here, you got some cut off pictures from Sports Illustrated swimsuit. I don't remember that. But at the very top here, it's hard to see, but those are like Jabot tags and a few tags from some other designers that I kept, because that's just how big of a deal that was. So the fashion was there, the music was there, the haircuts, you had to have the right hair. A lot of guys had a box cut. I remember getting my first box cut, and some guys had the pump where they would like the hair would get higher as you got closer to the front. Some guys would dye the front of their hair, like say their hair was black, the front of their hair might be brown or close to a blonde. And I remember somebody called it the sunny side up. So you had to have the right haircut, and you had all of that. You had the clothes. Matter of fact, I remember being at there was a barber college on 79th and Paxton called McCoy Barber College. And I remember I would go in there sometime. One day I went in there and got a haircut. I had my box haircut. I had my Guess shirt. I had my Gucci belt, my Jabots. And I remember some of the older guys in there like, yeah, man, you in the mix, man. You in the mix, which was perfect because it was 86 in the mix. So that's just how it was. And when you were like that, people knew you were house, and it was just everywhere. It was the hippest thing that was out.
Well, and a way of sort of building community through those signifiers of fashion and of, what you had hanging on your wall in college and all the flyers and such like that. So yeah, you have your haircut, you have your outfit, you're ready to go. Did you attend the Chosen Few? And tell us a little bit about the Chosen Few.
Well, it's my understanding the Chosen Few picnic started in 1990. I was not aware of it at that time. It took a few years. Later on, I started to hear people say there was an old school picnic, and that was kind of what it was known as. I didn't go to one till like 2005. So I was way, I think because by the time they got to doing those picnics, I think there was probably, I'm taking a guess here, educated guess, that was probably geared more towards the people who, like I referred to before, as first generation house,
right?
For them to kind of have a reunion and because by then they were like 10 years removed from when they were really, really doing it in the clubs. So that wasn't something that was, everybody didn't know about that, and it took a while for it to build and build. Now, I did go to recent Chosen Fews, but not in the 90s. No, I wasn't a part of that. And, the house scene had changed by then anyway, so no, I wasn't a part of those.
So how did the house scene sort of change in the 1990s? Tell us a little bit about how that evolved.
Well, the two biggest things that happened that changed it were the emergence of rap music and the decline of radio exposure for house. So like I said before, kids always want to be a part of what the hippest thing is. So I know, like for me, in the middle of the height of house music, okay, in 1986, the main radio station I was listening to for house was WHBK. There was a show on Saturday night called Disco Madness. DJ Lee Collins did. And as far as I'm concerned, it's the greatest house music radio show ever, because Lee Collins brought the hardcore club scene to the radio. Like a perfect example, my oldest cousin in my crew, he had friends who went to hear Ron Hardy at the Music Box in 85. They got tapes, brought them back. I was able to get access to the tapes. So late 85, early 86, I'm at the highest level of house you could be at for somebody who wasn't even old enough to go to the clubs, okay? And on WHPK, Lee Collins brought that same energy, those same songs a lot of times that were heard on those Ron Hardy tapes. Lee Collins was playing them. He seemed to have an unlimited amount of records, okay? Most of the great house music that I know as deep house, I heard Lee Collins play. Either he was the first one to play it, or he was the one who played the most effectively. In some cases, he was the only. There were songs I heard him play I've never heard since 86, 85. Okay, so somewhere in October of 86, so to speak, he stopped being on the radio. For me, my favorite radio show isn't on anymore, and nobody else is bringing that type of house to the radio. Okay, so that was a huge loss. There's a void that never really got filled. Okay, you still had other house shows going on, but not to that level. At the same time, Run DMC, Raising Hell. Okay, that album drops in summer '86. Now, why are we talking all this house rap music is getting big? Of course, everybody says hip hop now, but that was just a term in the '80s. It was about rap music. That's what how everybody called it, rap music. So all these groups, Run DMC, Houdini, LL Cool J, all these people are coming out. But the house music scene is so big in Chicago that a lot of people weren't paying attention to rap. We knew about it, but it wasn't like the main thing. So one day, matter of fact, it's my second day of high school. I'm coming home from school. I get on the bus at 95th Street to go home. CTA had a rule where there was no smoking, no littering, no radio playing on the bus or the train. I guess the bus driver was feeling a little adventurous that day because there was a guy on the bus playing a radio, and I get on and the song is going off. And then next thing you know, a new song comes on and this beat kicks in, this piano, and it's like, okay. And there are all these high school kids in the back, mostly girls, and they know the words to every song that's on. And I'm like, whoa, what is that? I'm like, okay, this is the thing here. I got to get up on some of this raps, you know? So by the time we got to my stop, I had heard maybe I'd heard like half the album. And I was like, I gotta get this, this Run DMC, okay? And then I talked to a friend of mine who was still in 8th grade, and she told me, well, they play raps on WHPK on Saturday afternoon. It's the same HBK I've been listening to my house with Lee Collins. I turned to the rap show that Saturday afternoon. It was like walking into a whole new world, you know. All of these songs, the rappers all sounded like they were either in high school or hadn't been out of high school that long. And I'm hearing people who we know now as legends, but they were making their very first song or two. People like Eric B. and Rakim, Salt and Pepper, the Beastie Boys. All of these folks had, they may only had one song or two songs out, but it was very captivating. And then you had underground rappers who the average person didn't know. So I got in on it at that level, and it was like, wow, it was just fascinating. And that continued to build. I watched that build through 86, 87, 88. By the time you got to summer 88, it's really broken through, okay? But again, the house music is still going. So it's not like it's killing house, but house is still there, but it's starting to fade from the radio. And the same way I was exposed to the house on the radio and people around my age, people who are younger than me now are not getting that same exposure to house because there's less of it on the radio. There's a lot more rap in videos. You had UNTV raps. People can come home and watch these video shows, Rap City on BT, all this. And so rap is getting bigger and bigger. And what starts to happen is the balance is like house, rap. First it was house, rap, and it just starts to change just like that. So by the time you got to 1990, it was still pretty much equal, but two things happened in 1992 that really changed everything. The first was the death of Ron Hardy. Okay, Ron Hardy passed away in 1992. He was sort of the soul of house to a certain degree. Okay, so with him no longer being in the picture, it kind of changes the energy. All right. The other thing is that by this point in 1990, you still had there was a radio show on KKC. They still did the mixes on Friday. There was a cat named Bobby Q Bobby who had a Sunday show where he would play house, and his show wasn't mixed. He would mostly just play the whole song. He might play a little bit of somebody's mixes. I remember him interviewing Ron Hardy on there one time, and Ron was saying that they just weren't making the house like they used to, because I have to say this too. You know, I was more so into the deep house, the stuff that was based off the Philly International and the stuff from the 70s, early 80s. But the DJs started making their own tracks, and that became house. So at first, it was all just house. Then they started calling the older stuff deep house, and the stuff that the DJs were making was just straight up house. So you had people like Chip E with Time to Jack and It's House. You had Jesse Saunders making his tracks. On and On was the record that he made that people kind of consider to be the breakthrough for house records. What nobody ever talks about, though, the flip side of that record was called On and On Tracks, because On and On, inside the song, he had about 5 different drum tracks that came up at various times. And on the flip side of the record, you had each one of those tracks was a full song. And there were at least 2 of them that got played a lot more than On and On did. You had other records that DJs were making. You had Marshall Jefferson and all of these folks making all these great anthems that are kind of what people know house music to be. So like songs like Move Your Body, Jack Your Body, Jack My Body, Bring Down the Walls, and all of these songs, they were like Ride the Rhythm was another great one. So most of those songs inspired people to action. You know, they were inspiring people to dance at the parties, or jack, which was the term for it. And then you had people like Larry Heard, who was known as Mr. Fingers. He had more kind of jazzier stuff. He had a cut called Mystery of Love and Can You Feel It? And so all of these different people making tracks. Little Lewis was at the end of the 80s. He was probably the most popular DJ on the scene, not simply because of his DJing, but because he would rent out these big hotels, mainly the Bismarck downtown, and he would have these parties normally around holidays, and he would use those parties to expose people to his new tracks. So he put out records, but he would use what we now know as demo versions. We just call them the original version, where a good example, he had a track, he had War Games was a big one. And he had one that started out fast and it slowed down and it stopped and then it sped back up again. And later on, he ended up adding the sounds of his girl on there, and that became French Kiss. He ends up getting a big record deal with Epic Records, and that ends up being the #1 dance song in the country, not just Chicago. So all of this was going on. So the house music scene was strong, but like I said, by the time you got to 92, there are less of those tracks being made that are having that kind of impact. There's less radio exposure, and you have rap music getting bigger and bigger. And I actually, most people don't know this, but you know, when I started my career in radio, I started in college in the fall of 92, being on the radio. I started college in the fall of 90, but in 92, I did a radio show. It was called The Party Before the Party on Saturday nights. I was playing house music, okay? But I found out even before I started, it was gonna be an issue. Like I remember putting up flyers, and there was a girl who was a freshman. I was a junior, and this girl, she's like, what is this? I said, it's a flyer for my new radio show. She said, what are you gonna play, house? And before I could even answer, she says, don't play house, play rap, play Dr. Dre, deep cover. Like, uh-oh. You know, and another girl I knew, she's like, oh, you and your house music. You know, it's like, it was too late because the younger people who were coming up were not into that sound anymore. And so house music by 92 going into 93 is no longer the main party music of the youth of Chicago, and rap music has taken over. And if you went to a party, you know, in the 80s, I wasn't really old enough to go to a lot of parties until my last year of high school. My mom was, you know, she was like, okay, yeah, you can go. So 89, I'm all over the place. But when I started going to real clubs, because Chicago used to have 18 and up clubs. So there were spots like the Edge of the Looking Glass and the Warehouse, not to be confused with the original Warehouse that Frankie Knuckles was at. There was another one, I believe it was on Randolph and Halsted, that was really popular in the early 90s. So places like that were playing house music, but it just got to a point where that was no longer the main thing. And so when you went to a party that wasn't at one of those clubs, so say like there was a spot called the Hyde Park Racquetball Club. They used to have a lot of parties, okay? I went to a party there in the summer of 92. And by that point, you would hear a little bit of house music, but for the most part, it would be more so rap. And matter of fact, I'll back up to the year before that. When I was in my second year of college, homecoming 91, we had Ferris come down and DJ the homecoming party. So he's playing mostly house in 91, okay? But then he puts on the Ghetto Boys Mind Playing Tricks on me. And everybody's like, uh-oh, here come the raps. And he just proceeds to play all the hottest rap songs. I mean, he's playing Naughty by Nature, OPP, Public Enemy, Can't Trust It, MC Breed, Ain't No, and the party is just crazy. And to this day, nobody remembers the house stuff, but everybody remembers that set of rap music that he played, because it was just, that was the energy of what people were into at that time. And I have to say real quick, he was the first house DJ to incorporate rap into house parties toward the end of the 80s. And it was very controversial at the time. You know, people who were into folk music in the 60s talk about when Bob Dylan went electric, and it caused all this controversy. That's what it was like when Ferris started playing rap at the house parties. A lot of house people were ticked off, but he knew that the times were changing, and there were people who looked forward to that. So a lot of times when Ferris came to the party, you knew, okay, he's gonna bring the raps. And sometimes he'd flip it up and play house, and it would be better than what the other house DJs did, you know. But by the time you got to 92, it was just a different energy in Chicago, and house was no longer the main party music for people anymore.
So I think that's a really good point to bring to our final question, which is, when you look at sort of the trajectory of house music and the community and how it built, how did it influence other music artists in Chicago and abroad, not only at that time, but as you think about sort of the lasting influence now, many years later?
Well, the thing is, with any musical movement, if it has a strong impact in its time, at a certain point, it's going to die down, but then it'll have a resurgence among the original audience. So even though it stopped being the main party music, it never totally went away. There was still elements of house music in other areas. You know, you had artists in 93, 94 making tracks in Chicago that people didn't necessarily call them house at the time, but they kind of fit into a different lane of house. You know, there's a track called The Percolator that's still really big. You know, there was a track called Brighter Days by an artist named Deja. You know, that was really big. You had a subgenre that we used to call ghetto house, you know, where they would take little bits and pieces of house or make tracks similar to that, but speed them up. They were really influenced by like Luke and the Two Live Crew seemed to be a big influence. The lyrics were very sexual. Sometimes they were flat out X-rated, you know, but they had elements of house, and you would still hear some of the original house tracks played from time to time. And so people who made music were still going to be influenced by that because it was such a big deal, especially since in the 85, 86 era, a lot of those tracks were able to break through and make it overseas and become big in England and some of these other countries. And that's why a lot of those DJs to this day, they go into other countries and they can play and do really well, because by them being from Chicago, the people in the other places know that they are the masters of this. They know what they're doing. So they're going to listen and see what they're doing. A lot of times they have the freedom to do things and play records in those other countries that maybe they don't have here. You know, so the influence continues beyond what it is here or what it was here. So it's never going to totally go away. And it's always going to be incorporated into different dance musics. A lot of R&B or pop artists have dance mixes of this song, even if it's slow songs, even if it's a ballad, they may have a house version, you know, and that ends up being a big deal for the dance community.
That's great. Well, Marcus, thank you so much. This has been awesome. And I know that you have said that you would share a link to your mixes that people can listen if they want to hear some of this music. So we'll make sure that we'll post that in the chat as well here so that folks can
and let me clarify, they're not my mixes. I didn't
collection,
but
a list you
I was
curated.
able to, right, I collected all these mixes over the years. So I have about 120 mixes posted that were done between 1984 and 1992 by all the different house DJs from the classic house era. So they're posted on Mixcloud. It's mixcloud.com/Marcus Chapman House. So you go on that link, you can, and they're posted mostly in chronological order. So you can kind of hear the development of the history, the types of songs that were being played, the differences between like 84, 86, or 89, and going to 92. And it's really cool to hear all of that. I'm glad I was able to preserve those digitally and be able to share them with everybody. Because I listen to them every now and then, put them on in the car, or when I'm working out or something, So yeah.
That's great. You're almost like a librarian of house music, right?
I'm a music historian, period. I mean, whether it's house, funk, rock, whatever. I mean, I just got back in town. I was in Detroit last week filming some special Unsung episodes. I was in Dayton, Ohio this past weekend participating in this Funk Hall of Fame symposium. I did a presentation about funk album cover art. So yeah, I'm all over the place doing stuff.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Marcus. And I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Sharon, who's going to give us some closing remarks.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have today. But I want to thank Mark Chapman for being here with us today. Thanks to CPL's Tech Leland Mosley for producing this event, and CPL's African American Heritage Committee for co-sponsoring. And thanks to all of you for being here. Please visit onebook1chicago.org for information on other upcoming events around our theme, Neighborhoods, Our City's Bedrock, including book discussions, films, author events, art programs, and more. Also, visit the CPL YouTube and Facebook pages for on-demand video content, including tonight's program. Have a great week, everyone.